Chapter 9. Soap. It was 2 o'clock that afternoon when James woke up and decided to go check on Kerry. He listened at her door for a second to make sure she wasn't sleeping, but he could hear her TV. "Yo," James grinned as he poked his head inside the door. "How was the punishment run?" Kerry was sitting on her bed in a dressing gown. She paused her DVD recorder and shrugged. "Oh, it was great fun. You can imagine what sort of mood Large was in after you'd all upset him. Me and Dana went and spoke to the chairman about the way he's bullying Lauren. He said he's going to speak to Mr. Pike and Mr. Large about what happened." Kerry smiled. "I've heard that Mr. Large has got to watch his step. He's already had a couple of written warnings about his conduct." "Imagine if he got sacked," James grinned, as he reached into his pocket and grabbed a sheet of turquoise paper. "It would be so beautiful." Kerry laughed. "Yeah, he'd probably have to take a job as a nightclub doorman or a security guard." "I don't care what job he gets," James said, grinning like an idiot and fanning the piece of paper in front of his face. "Just so long as he's out of my life." "Okay, I get the hint," Kerry sighed. "What's on the piece of paper?" James flicked the sheet across to Kerry and slumped theatrically across her bed. "I'm a sick little boy," he giggled. Kerry raised a hand to slap him. "Get your boots off my bed," she said sharply. "How many times do I have to tell you?" James rolled onto his back and started pulling off his boots as Kerry read the note aloud. "James Adams, 10 days excused from all physical activity due to dehydration and exhaustion." "How did you pull that little scam?" "It's not a scam. I went to the medical unit to get the wound on my back cleaned up. The nurse touched me and asked why I was all hot and clammy. I told her how I felt weak during the exercise. She reckons I'm dehydrated and probably still under the weather from that stomach bug last week." Kerry shook her head. "I still reckon you're faking. The nurse also said that lots of snogging would help me recuperate." "Oh, I'm sure she did, James. I'm not going anywhere near you if you're hot and clammy. I don't want your germs." James's head was flat against the double bed, while Kerry was propped up so she could see the TV. He moved forward a few centimetres and delicately kissed Kerry's wrist. "You've got cute little hands," James said. Kerry smiled as she lifted her hand off the bed and stroked James's cheek. "What are you after, Adams?" "Nothing. I was just thinking, it's a nice day out. Maybe we could make sandwiches and go up to the lake. It's usually packed when it's sunny, but all the other kids are in lessons today, so we'd have it to ourselves. Maybe we could splash around, chill out, lie in the sun for a while." Kerry looked out the window. "It is nice out, but I'm halfway through EastEnders." James scowled at the screen. "You and your dopey soap operas. Violet's varicose veins and Sammy stealing the Christmas club money to pay for his sex change. I don't know how you sit through that rubbish every day." "Well, I happen to like them," Kerry said. "So you can either sit with me quietly until it finishes, or you can bog off." "Can we go for a picnic after?" Kerry shook her head. "I've got neighbours to watch after this." James tutted. "God, Kerry, you're so boring sometimes." "Haven't you got about 50 lots of homework piled up on your desk?" Kerry said bitterly. "Why don't you actually do it for a change, instead of ripping off me or Kyle?" "Fine, I'll go if you don't want me," James said, as he got off the bed. "I just thought a picnic would be fun." "Let's face it," Kerry said. "You don't want a picnic. You want a quick swim, then you want to spend the rest of the afternoon snogging and trying to get your hands on my boobs." "Well, you are supposed to be my girlfriend. I waited for you for 6 months while you were in Japan. You come back and you never want to do anything. I don't know why you even want a boyfriend." Kerry jumped off the bed and put on a look of mock astonishment. "Do you know what, James?" she snapped. "That's the most sensible thing you've said all day. Why do I want a boyfriend? All you do is moan on and on about school. I'm sick of lending you money and bailing you out with homework that you left until the last minute. I'm sick of not being able to chill out or go where I want with the girls because you're always around. In fact, Kerry spat, I'm sick of everything about you. Are you dumping me? James asked dumbly. Bingo, Kerry nodded. Consider yourself dumped. Now, if you'd be so kind as to get your worthless rump out of my room. But Kerry barged past James and opened her door. Out. Kerry, come on, don't you think you're overreacting? Get out! She screamed. James did as he was told, because Kerry had one of her I'm about to shatter your arms and legs looks about her. He stepped out of the room, and a gale rushed through his hair as the door slammed behind his head. The only other person sharing the long corridor with James was a newly recruited cherub called Andy Lagan. The 11-year-old blue shirt was at a loose end until the next basic training session started in 2 months. James looked at him and shrugged. You know what, kid? Girls are all bloody loonies. Andy looked baffled by James's comment. Kerry reopened her door and screamed out, "And you can take your stinking boots with you." The first boot crashed harmlessly against the wall, but the second hit James square in the back of the head. James turned to have a go back, but the door slammed in his face before he got a chance. James pounded on the door. You know what? I'm better off without you. Moody cow. James realised Andy was grinning. He charged forward and faced the kid off. Do you reckon this is funny? No, Andy smirked, trying to keep a straight face. James grabbed Andy by his shoulders and wiped his grin off by pushing him against the wall. You want to try laughing at me again? James snarled. I'm sorry, the kid grovelled as he looked up at his significantly larger adversary. I just couldn't help laughing when she threw the boot at your head. Apology or not, James was deeply upset by what Kerry had just done, and he couldn't take someone laughing at him. He raised a hand and smacked Andy across the face before giving him a powerful shove. The kid bounced off the wall before stumbling backwards into a heap on the floor. James stood over him with his fists bunched. Still think this is funny? Laugh some more and see what you get. Andy gasped tearfully as he crawled back across the carpet. Leave me alone, he sniffed. James watched a tear streak down Andy's face. He looked nervously over his shoulder to check that nobody else was around, before reaching forward to pick the kid up. I'm really sorry, he muttered as his anger deflated. I don't know what came over me. My girlfriend just dumped me, and I went kind of mad. Andy screamed out, Don't come near me, you moron! James's handler, Meryl Spencer, had an office down the hallway, and she came out to investigate the noise. James saw Meryl storming towards the scene as Kerry emerged from her room and barged him out of the way. Kerry crouched down and handed Andy a clean tissue to dab his face. She cast a furious backwards glance. For God's sake, James, what is the matter with you? Chapter 10. Unpopular. Meryl spent the best part of an hour shouting at James, while James spent the best part of an hour wondering how one idiotic flash of anger had landed him in such deep trouble. When he finally got out of Meryl's office, he headed down to the canteen for dinner. He got a creepy feeling that people were talking behind his back while he was in the queue, and none of the gang looked happy when he set his tray down. James's crowd was gathered around the 2 pushed-together tables where they always sat. Shaq, Connor, Gabriel, Kerry, and Kyle. The only absentees were Bruce, who was on a mission, and Callum, who was on the toilet. James made a point of sitting as far away from Kerry as possible, in a seat opposite Kyle, who had a foam collar around his neck. James knew they weren't exactly going to be falling over themselves to congratulate him on thumping an 11-year-old, but he thought he'd be okay if he apologised and laid the severity of his punishment on thick. I'm not allowed to go on holiday to the hostel this summer, he said solemnly. I'm suspended from missions for a month, and I've got to clean up the mission preparation building every night for 3 months. Oh, and I've got to start anger management sessions with a counsellor. Kyle and the others carried on eating without making a response. James tried again. I really messed up. I mean, I know what I did was bad. Well, totally unacceptable, really, but... Gabriel angrily cracked the wall of silence. James, nobody at this table is interested. Why don't you go and sit somewhere else? James wasn't expecting a warm welcome, but Gabriel's harshness shocked him. You know how I fly off the handle sometimes? He said weakly, glancing at the faces around him and hoping for some sign of support. Kyle spoke firmly. If you don't move, then we all will. Do you know what Andy's been through these past few months? Merrill had been through Andy's life story, but that didn't stop James from getting a reminder. His grandma died in a fire, Shaq said. The police found out it was arson and accused Andy of killing her. The poor kids spent 6 months locked up in secure accommodation until someone grassed up the kids who really did it. Kyle nodded. He tried to kill himself before he came to campus. He passed the introductory tests, but he didn't go into basic training straight away because he's still pretty messed up. And you beat him up, Connor said accusingly. You're scum. Come on, James said in desperation. I didn't beat him up. It was one slap and a push. I'll say sorry and give him a couple of my PlayStation games to make it up, okay? Gabriel and Kyle slowly shook their heads. James realised he wasn't going to talk anyone around. Fine, James said, as he stood up briskly and grabbed his tray. He tried adding, I've got other friends, but he found there was a lump in his throat. He looked for somewhere to sit. He thought about heading towards Lauren and Bethany, but sitting with a bunch of littler kids wasn't cool, and James doubted they'd be very welcoming. He spotted a few other friendly faces, kids he'd been on training with and kids who were in his classes, but they all had their own little groupings, and crashing on another crowd wasn't the done thing. He ended up alone at the back of the canteen. Nobody ever sat there unless the joint was packed out, because you could smell the congealed food that had just been scraped into the bins. After he'd eaten, James crashed out on his bed and sulked. 4 hours earlier, he'd been planning a picnic with Kerry, he had a 10-day exemption from exercise, and the prospect of 5 weeks sunning it at CHERUB summer hostel at the end of the month. Now his whole life was down the toilet. Dumped by Kerry, no friends, no holiday, and he could have sworn the mound of homework piled up on his desk was grinning at him. There was a triple knock at the door. Lauren's knock. Yeah, James said unenthusiastically. He wasn't sure how he felt about seeing Lauren. He kind of wanted to see her, but he didn't want the lecture she was going to give him, however much he knew he deserved it. You okay? Lauren asked, as James sat up on his bed. You look like you've been crying. I haven't, he said defensively, but then he shrugged. Yeah, a bit. Kyle said it's okay for me to speak to you, seeing as I'm your sister. James was narked. What? You have to ask that idiot's permission to speak to me now? Lauren wagged her finger. Don't knock Kyle. Him and Gabriel saved your butt. You don't know what you're talking about, James tutted. You should have seen them at dinner. They were the ringleaders. Nuh-uh, Lauren said, shaking her head. Andy's being looked after by 2 massive 16-year-olds. When they found out what happened, they were going to batter you. Kyle was the one who talked them out of it. He reckoned blanking you would be more effective. At least if they'd beaten me up, it would be over and done with. It's all out of proportion, Lauren. I threw 1 punch. In fact, it wasn't even a punch. It was a slap. You just don't get it, do you? Lauren said, grinding her palm against the side of her head in frustration. Get what? This keeps happening, James. You lose your temper and lash out at people. Like when? When you were in year 5 and you beat that kid up and smashed all the art equipment. In year 6 when you twisted that kid's leg around and nearly broke his ankle. You beat up Samantha Jennings the day Mum died. You got in trouble when you were at Nebraska House. You lost your temper and stomped on Kerry's hand in basic training. Come to think of it, you've battered me a couple of times as well. We were always getting in fights when we were little, Lauren. All kids do that. Lauren shook her head. That time you gave me a black eye? We told Mum it was an accident, but it wasn't, was it? You went nuts because I ate a tiny piece of your Easter egg. Come on, Lauren, I was 10 years old. You're making me sound like some foaming at the mouth psychopath. You might not be a psycho, but you have got a nasty side. I hope you do end up losing all your friends over this, James. I hope you never get back with Kerry. Maybe that will make you see that you can't go around throwing wobblers and beating people up. James felt punch drunk from Lauren's onslaught. Thanks a lot, he sniffed. I needed that. Ah, diddums, Lauren shrugged. I thought you'd finally grown out of this nonsense. Kerry dumped me, James sniffed. There was no reason behind it. Lauren knew her brother was fishing for sympathy and totally ignored him. So what's going to happen if you don't grow out of this, James? Are you going to end up battering your wife and kids someday? James gasped. Lauren, don't be stupid. I'd never do that. Lauren mocked James's voice. You know I've got a bad temper. I can't help it sometimes. So, if you can't help it, how can you know? Lauren, I'd never touch my wife and kids. I swear to God. Well, here's an oath for you, Lauren said, waggling her finger under her brother's nose. I'm sick of you acting like a moron. So on our mum's grave, if this happens one more time, I'm never speaking to you again. Lauren stood up and headed for the door. Lauren, James shouted desperately. She stopped. What? James shrugged. I don't know. Stay with me for a bit. Watch TV. I don't feel like being on my own. Lauren shook her head. There's a birthday party on my floor. I'm going to go upstairs and try to enjoy myself. If you're stuck here on your own feeling miserable, whose fault is that? Lauren turned around and slammed the door after herself. James collapsed onto his bed. Lauren hadn't so much touched a raw nerve as rubbed over a whole bunch of them with a cheese grater. As he choked back more tears, James realised that every time he lashed out, it was him that got hurt most. He had to learn to control his temper. Chapter 11. Promises. CHERUB. Good Behaviour Contract. I, James Robert Adams, promise to abide by the following. Number 1. I agree to respect all my fellow cherubs and cherub staff. Number 2. I will not behave in an abusive way to anyone, either verbally or physically. Number 3. I will go to regular anger management sessions with a counsellor. Number 4. If I feel angry, I will use the techniques taught by my counsellor to control my mood. I will not lash out. Number 5. I will write an apology to Andy Lagan. Number 6. I will catch up on my backlog of homework. I will not ask to copy work off my classmates, and I understand that I will not be allowed to go off campus until I have completely caught up. Number 7. I agree to clean the mission preparation building between 5 and 7 p.m. every day except Sunday, either for 3 months or until I'm sent on a mission. Number 8. I will be banned from missions for 1 month. This ban will be extended to 3 months if I have not caught up with my homework within this time. Number 9. I agree that I will not be entitled to a holiday at the CHERUB Summer Hostel this year because of what I did. Number 10. I agree to not go moaning to my handler Meryl Spencer, asking her to change stuff in this contract after I have signed it. I understand that this contract will be reviewed after 3 months. If I have not met all 10 criteria, I will be subject to severe punishment, which might include being permanently excluded from CHERUB. Signed J.R. Adams, handler's signature M. Spencer, witnessed by L. Z. Adams.